Hi, everybody. I'm Bill Squadron. I'm president of Our Energy Policy, and thank you for joining us today for our program on nuclear power. And I know a lot of you probably are aware that there were kind of three things that we never mentioned in New York for decades: the Knicks, the Jets, and nuclear. We still don't talk much about the Jets. But things have changed when it comes to the issue of nuclear power. And I think you're in for a fascinating conversation today with our three panelists and our moderator. And also, I encourage you all to note your questions, because we will open it up for questions toward the end of the program. So thanks. Before we jump in, we do want to spend a minute acknowledging a phenomenal friend of OEP and someone really beloved in the energy community, Mike Shatskin, who passed away several months ago. We just want to pay tribute to Mike. Many of you knew him. Really beloved, someone who was a Renaissance person, publisher, author, energy activist, and somebody who always had very bold and strong opinions, but was also open to conversation, discussion, and to other ideas, which is really the DNA of our energy policy, as so many of you know. And so we really want to pay tribute to Mike and say how much we miss him. He was a great friend of ours, and I know many of you who knew him well miss him deeply. So Mike was very active in the nuclear space, particularly the last couple of years, gave us a lot of good input on it, and for this program today, we wanted to pay him that acknowledgement. I do want to thank our partners. OEP is able to put on the many programs that you all are aware of: our dinners, our breakfasts, our webinars, our luncheon events like this one, our working sessions, our energy library. There's some information about that on your tables. If you don't take advantage of the library, I highly recommend that you do. It is the most extensive repository of papers, reports, studies, very well vetted, very well indexed. If you're working on a particular issue, anything from biofuels to electric vehicles to oil and gas, you'll find materials there that'll be helpful. And that's a big part of our program, so I encourage you to do it. We also left little notebooks on almost all of your seats. We actually had such a great turnout today. We may have run out, but hopefully it was on your seat. And you'll hear a little bit later about our new individual OEP Leadership Circle, which we would hope is individuals that you would consider joining and supporting our programs. So I'm now going to bring up our panel. I do want to thank our co-host today, Natura Resources. I also want to thank Jim Tynan from Morgan Lewis, who helped us with the program today. We have a great discussion, and as I said, please note any questions you have, because we'll leave some time at the end. So if I can ask our panelists to come up. And as they're coming up, let me introduce our moderator. Ellen Ginsberg is the Senior Vice President and General Counsel of the Nuclear Energy Institute. More importantly, really one of the foremost authorities on nuclear policy regulation that we have in this country. We're very privileged to have her moderating the discussion today. So Ellen and all of our panel.
Can you hear me? Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for allowing me to participate in this event. It's fantastic to be before you, and before I get started, I just want to tell Bill that I don't mention the Jets either. I'm a Giants fan. So, in any case, I have the pleasure today of introducing three of the individuals who are leaders in the nuclear sector and in the energy sector more broadly. To my left is Jim Schaefer. I was doing it alphabetically, and now they're not seated alphabetically. So Jim Schaefer is a senior managing director with Guggenheim Securities Investment Banking, and he covers a number of electric and gas and renewable energy accounts, and has had an extraordinary experience with energy-related mergers, acquisition, and financing. He's had more than 20 years of experience, and he was previously at UBS, at Lehman, at Salomon Brothers, and at Chase. So Jim is really an expert, and I will say Jim has been a leader in allowing the financial industry to better understand the financial community, to better understand nuclear and why nuclear should be far more considered than it had been in the past, and we can get into that in a minute. Next to him is Doug Robison, and Doug is founder and president of Natura Resources. And throughout Doug's career in the energy sector, he's always been a leader. He's been a leader out ahead of others, as he was as a partner and co-founder, president, and executive chair of EXL Petroleum, which is a Permian Basin oil and gas exploration and production company. He's now founder, as I mentioned, of Natura Resources, but he also has extensive experience working with state government. He was appointed by former Texas Governor Rick Perry to serve on the Texas Energy Planning Council, and he also co-chaired the Energy Supply Committee, during which time he identified the importance of nuclear energy as a source and should be a bigger part of the national portfolio. And then finally, but certainly not least, is John Williams. John was appointed as Executive Vice President for Policy and Regulatory Affairs of the New York State Energy Resource and Development Authority. Most of you know it by NYSERDA. And that was in October of 2022. And since then, he's made a remarkable imprint on NYSERDA, not just in the regulatory arena, but also in moving along the roadmap that Kathy Hochul, Governor Hochul, encouraged NYSERDA to undertake and review the opportunities for nuclear. He's developed a number of different areas. He's responsible for economic analysis, as well as performance management, and much, much more. So rather than go on at length, which I've already done, I will now turn to our esteemed panel. So with that, let's turn to the conversation. Before I actually go to the members of the panel, I thought I would just give you a moment of perspective and try and set a theme here. And the theme I'd like to establish is, this is not your father's nuclear industry. And why do I say that? I say that because in years past, nuclear has been considered, when you looked at the ESG features of nuclear, it was considered with pornography, literally pornography, alcohol, firearms, and other assorted and sundry negative attributes. It's taken us a while to make inroads, if you will, in the financial community, with the public, et cetera, and frankly with utilities, to understand why nuclear is a good move going forward. And so what we have now is we have kind of a three-legged stool that's very, very important, and is another reason why I say I bring to you this theme of nuclear not being your father's industry. First, we have huge bipartisan support, and in years past, you would see a distinct difference between kind of liberals and conservatives on nuclear, and that's just not true anymore for a variety of reasons. We have done very, very well in Congress, and as we'll get into, nuclear is very much more appreciated, if you will, for its attributes in the state. That's one. The second one is innovation, and Doug can speak extensively to the nature of the innovation that nuclear has. We have high-temperature gas reactors, we have light water reactors, we have molten salt reactors, et cetera. So that's a second thing. And the third thing is community acceptance and public acceptance, and that's changed rather markedly. So with that, I've just set the stage. Now let's get into the details and have all of you join the conversation. First, I think without the increase in demand, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation. And demand comes in two forms. It comes in the need for power, but it also comes in the need for clean power. So let me open it up. Where do you see demand, and where do you see nuclear fitting into demand?
So before I hit the specific part of your question, I'm going to challenge one thing that you just said, Ellen.
Oh,
And,
good.
we're good friends. But my view, even without the change in demand, which we've all witnessed over the last 24 months, I believe strongly that for us to get to clean, in other words, to swap out roughly, call it 3/4 of our electric generation, which is fossil fuel, in order to do that, we were going to have all paths led through Doug and his team. Anyway, that was meant somewhat seriously.
No, I agree.
Through the fission world. And so you cannot solve the challenge of being clean, and I don't want to offend anyone in the room when I say this. You can't solve it with renewables and batteries. It just doesn't work. And people need to wake up to that really fast. We need baseload power, and we need a lot of it, and renewables and batteries are not baseload, okay? That's it. So if you want to solve the underlying, just stop where we are today and get to clean, and I do believe that both sides of the aisle in their own ways eventually want to get there, all paths run through baseload clean, and then you look at the options available. There's carbon capture and sequestration, which folks in the Permian Basin are working on, and other places. That's great. Geothermal, that's great. I hate to say it though, my view, and I think a lot of folks that I talk to these days view those as more niche technologies. Hydrogen, wonderful product, but it's expensive. It's a battery. 4 electrons for every hydrogen molecule. So what's really important to understand here, in my mind, is that we had to head down the new nuclear path to get to clean. Now with the demand, which is enormous, and however you want to define that, if you're a Southern company, as an example, good friends, you just built 2 reactors. You went through hell doing it. Pardon for the bluntness, but it's tough when you start an industrial technology suite. That didn't go great, but look, right now, Southern Company faces over 30,000 megawatts of demand of some kind, baseload demand right now. And the number is probably higher than that. I'm sorry, that's just Georgia Power. That's not Southern Company, that's just Georgia Power. You look at VEPCO, you look at Dominion's utility, they're talking about the need for 5,000 megawatts every single year indefinitely, okay? An enormous change in demand. And at the same time, so that's the tech data center impact in part. We're also trying to electrify transportation to varying degrees at various points in time, but I think over time we will get back on that track more aggressively. There is just no question that we have to get really good at this industry again. And so what that means is taking a long-term view about developing something akin to the aerospace sector, because that's how large this could be in terms of the opportunity to create this industrialized suite of products. And it's not just Doug's company, it's probably, we need an oligopolistic industry quickly here. Talk more about that later. So we need 5 to 7 companies that are really good at fission. And most of the good fission technology on the planet sits either in Texas or in other parts of the US. A lot of the fission that was developed over the years through the DOE, through a nuclear navy, entities like BWXT, GE, we sit on an incredible suite of technologies. And it's a really exciting time to see this start to happen, but it's going to take us years to get the industry up and running, and a long-term commitment, which Wall Street is typically not good at.
Right. Wow. Okay, so John, talk a little bit about what you see in terms of demand in New York. I mentioned that Governor Hochul is very eager to have nuclear. What do you see as the demand, and why is she going directly to nuclear for supplying that demand?
Yeah. Well, it's a couple of reasons, I would say. One is our state policy is pushing us in the direction where we need a zero emission grid. And I think that is just baseline, the way that we think about things in New York. What is the way that we're going to ultimately realize that outcome? Baseload power, I would agree. We've got an aging fleet. We have to think about what that means. And New York, hasn't been famous maybe over the past several years for, tremendous growth in demand. But when we think about the nature of what that base load is going to look like, it's actually going to shift over time, right? There's a lot of need for electrification of fuel-based load. That's creating new base load, right? Whether we're thinking about the way our buildings are going to be functioning, the way our transportation systems are going to be running, we're going to need to think about how we're going to put more and more of that onto our electric system. And that's going to create a different profile for our baseload energy. Third is, the governor does not want to be thinking we're going to leave any economic development on the table. So there is a tremendous amount of activity that's happening already when we think about two kind of very high profile projects that have announced in New York. Those two projects alone add 1/3 demand to the current grid. So that doesn't just happen with any kind of load coming in. It also is not going to be able to happen. I'm going to do a little bit of treason here, but so bear with me, don't quote me on this. But I think I'm going to need to agree a little bit with Jim. We can't think about renewables as the only solution to get to that. Renewables will certainly play in this new system. But when we think about the kind of the power requirements coming from a lot of that new economic demand, and that's just manufacturing. I haven't even gotten to the New York play for AI and data centers. That is still a game that has yet to be played in New York, and we want to play. But the power, the actual overall demand is significant. We've done some models where the New York grid could potentially just double within 15 to 20 years. That's something we've never really planned for in the past. But the other thing everybody has to also just keep in mind is the power attributes that this new economic development comes with. Right? This needs very high reliability. This needs a lot of insurance that the nature of the power, the amount of power, the quality of that power is going to be available at all times, because these are very capital-intensive facilities. They are in extremely competitive marketplaces, and we cannot have an energy system that even with several seconds worth of interruption is going to cost multiple millions of dollars of economic loss to those facilities. That just isn't going to make New York attractive. So what we do need to think about with demand in New York and how we are going to meet it is how are we going to think about kind of that zero emission base load? What are the technology suites to look at then? And then I think what the new nuclear technologies offer is a much broader decision-making set that we can take on when it comes to power that can meet that new economic demand. It doesn't all necessarily all have to be on the grid all the time, right? There's a lot of these modular systems, smaller systems that are going to do just great at being co-located, co-hosted by some of this demand. And we just need to figure out what the right equation looks like. And that's all part and parcel of the way that we're going to be thinking. It's not going to be a very singular, systematic approach to how we're going to meet that demand. And we have to be able to look at the technology types and apply them to what that demand looks like in order to get the best outcomes.
That's a perfect segue to technology types. Doug, talk to us a little bit about, you are not building a light water reactor. Explain what you're building and why that technology is attractive.
I will. I'd like to touch on grid just 1 second.
Go right ahead.
So I served on Governor Perry's appointment. That was in 2004 when my committee said nuclear is going to be a fuel source for the future for baseload power particularly. And I served on Governor Abbott's Advanced Nuclear Working Group. The grid in Texas is currently 90 gigawatts. The projected growth in the next 6 years, and this is a grid that we're struggling to maintain with all the power that we have in Texas, is in the next 6 years is going to grow to over 150 gigawatts. And on top of that, the first Stargate initiative, which is a 1.2 gigawatt center, is being deployed in Abilene, Texas by coincidence. And it's going to be larger than Central Park. And there are 10 of those, and that's another 15 to 20 gigawatts on top of the 150 gigawatts. And so the need to get to power is real. I mean, and the Texas legislature is meeting as we speak, and we'll see what comes out of that session. So I wanted to say that about the grid, where we are in Texas. So we're deploying Natura Resources. We have a permit from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I never fail to show this. Thank you. There are only 2 of those in existence. We are one of only 2 advanced reactor permits that have been issued by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that says you're safe to build a reactor. We got that in September of last year. 4 years of work to get there, 150 researchers. We're in the process of finishing our detailed engineering design. If you watch Fox Business, you may have seen me on interviews yesterday from the bottom of a cavern. That was our research bay. It's the only advanced reactor facility in the nation. So Natura Resources is deploying a Generation 4 technology that it's confusing. I'm an oil and gas guy, and it's taken 150 researchers several years to explain this to me. Two main technological differences. We are not solid fueled, we're liquid fueled. So the liquid is in the molten salt. What that means is the advantage is that we burn up 100% of our fuel. We do not throw fuel away, so do we not generate unspent nuclear fuel. In fact, we can utilize existing spent nuclear fuel as fuel for molten salt reactors, and we can capture nuclear isotopes that are very valuable for medical treatments. That's liquid fuel. That's the liquid fuel. The other is we're molten salt cooled. A reactor, when fission happens in the core at the moderator, it creates a tremendous amount of heat. You have to move that heat from the core to where ultimately you're going to turn it into steam, turn a turbine, make electricity. Water, which is a light water reactor, uses water. Any water-cooled reactor operates at relatively low temperatures, but extremely high pressures because you're dealing with steam, high-pressure steam. Molten salt is our heat transfer fluid. As a result of that, we operate at over twice the temperature of a light water reactor. That high process heat is incredibly valuable for chemical manufacturing, for water desalinization, and we operate at basically atmospheric pressure, the pressure that glass of water is on your table, because the salt never flashes to a steam. The point that when molten salt becomes a steam is higher than the melting temperature of the stainless steel of the reactor. So you go from a solid, our salt melts at about 450 degrees C, goes to a liquid. At that point, it behaves like water, so it can transfer the heat from the reactor core to where you're generating power. If we ever lose containment, if we want to shut it down, the second that the salt leaves containment, it freezes back into a solid. And so that's called walk-away safe, passive safety. And it's a big part of our review process of that permit we received in September of last year from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So this small modular reactor, everything that we're doing fits on the back of a semi by intention, so it allows central manufacturing and then deployment, even to New York, around the country, around the world.
Even from New York.
Even from New York, absolutely.
So most of you probably know that there are 3 different sort of sizes, and each of the sizes has different use cases. There are microreactors that are basically, low 1 to 10, 1 to 20 sort of megawatts. 20 to 300 is roughly considered a SMR, and then over 300 is considered, 300 plus is considered a large reactor. And for each of these reactors, you're going to have a different use case. Jim, I don't know if you have thoughts on how you finance the different reactors. If you want to talk a little bit, obviously the cost of the light water reactor, you referred to this with respect to Southern Company, is larger. Talk a little bit about what you see about getting to scale with some of these new, more innovative technologies.
Thanks. So with any new industrial technology, you need customers, right? So there's clearly demand for the type of electricity that's coming out of units like Doug and teams. The issue is the first-of-a-kind risk and who's going to take the equity risk around building these first-of-a-kind units. And historically, with some of the clean tech sectors like solar and wind and batteries, we've had a lot of subsidies, over $150 billion of subsidies, and that grows. A lot of those subsidies, and this is an editorial, allowed for the money to move overseas and into China. So we've basically, and the Europeans as well, created a nice manufacturing sector in China for those industrial products. Biofuels also has had a lot of subsidies over the years. The biofuels production business remains in our country, and we're one of the world's leading green fuel producers. At the end of the day, our only real competition here around new nuclear is Russia and China. Everyone is looking to our technology for the most part. Yes, the Brits have Rolls-Royce, the Swedes have a technology, the French are working on one, but there's over 50 fission, young and mature fission companies in the US alone. And so at the end of the day, what these companies need are contracts. They need offtake agreements. The ITC helps a lot, but the ITC needs to be restructured out of its current form, and that's going to require the federal government to coordinate and work on changing some of the rules around the ITC. We need the LPO. We need inexpensive, debt. But at the heart of it is long-term agreements for purchase power out of units produced by Natura and entities like Natura. And then once you have those contracts, presumably the equity will show up and want to invest in these units. But that's how you step through this. We need the data center and tech companies specifically to enter into 20-year plus long-term PPAs at a price that's priced high enough to deal with the first-of-a-kind risk from these units. And one of the messages that we've sent that crowd is, look, you all have trillion-dollar-plus market caps, a bunch of them, right? The entire market cap of the electric sector, combined utility market caps, Canada, US, is about $1 trillion. And those entities are the most conservative customers you could ever imagine. They're not set up by states to take on a lot of risk. And Governor Hochul and team can't introduce to the ratepayers of New York equity risk. So what we need here is a marriage between the entities that can truly afford this first-of-a-kind risk. Because look, a lot of these companies want to be clean, right? Google wants to be clean. Meta, they all have announced, we will be clean. Well, if they want clean, and if I'm right, that all paths lead down the new nuclear pathway, they need to step up with the contracts, and I'd even argue the equity. Most of the OEMs are not financed in a way that they can build 4 or 5 of their own units. Now, maybe 1 or 2 of them, and Doug and team are working on that now, and others are as well. But to really get this train rolling down the track and get the supply chain in place, we need long-term commitments from the folks that are creating a lot of this demand right now. And then at the same time, we need money to step up that's going to say, all right, we got appropriately priced contracts. Now we're willing to take on the first-of-a-kind risk. And I consider first-of-a-kind risk not just the first unit, no offense. It's probably the 3rd, 4th, or 5th units that folks are going to want to see before your Dominions and Southerns are placing more orders, right? You're not going to see any of these entities lean into this because they're not set up by the states to lean into this unless they see these units up and running. So what we're facing now is this launch pad, right? We're looking at this scene, and yeah, it's great that Elon and team are sending spaceships into the outer atmosphere, and they've been able to raise a lot of money, and Blue Origin, right? A lot of money raised in that arena. What we need to do now is get our acts together and think long-term about what this planet needs and commit real money towards these technology pathways. I'll stop. I can keep going.
Yes, I know you can keep going. So let's break this down a little bit because you packed a lot into what you just said. Start with technology validation. Doug, talk a little bit about technology validation and why that's so important, not just for the financing, but more broadly for the licensing, et cetera. Give us a little bit of your view on that.
Well, when we're asked early on, and still get asked every now and then, what is the technology risk that you're trying to solve? What part of that puzzle? Frankly, there are none. We know molten salt reactors work. They deployed one in the 60s. China, who was in the news here recently on their molten salt thorium reactor. The largest risk was, can you get a license? Yes, we got a license. And then you have to do that first of a kind. So for us, the first of a kind is one we're building today going to be housed at Abilene Christian University as a university research reactor for Natura. It's a demonstration reactor. It proves we can get a license. But the other thing it does is we are establishing the supply chain as we speak, because we're entering into EPC agreements, and so we know who's going to fabricate our reactor core, probably going to come out of Huntsville, Alabama, by Teledyne Brown. We know where our pump vendors are. We know where the valve vendors are. We solved the fuel problem by going from a HALEU fuel to an LEU plus for our commercial reactors. So when we build our first reactor, our commercial reactor, it won't be the first one we built, because we're building the first one now. Because it's a research reactor, we can do it with private capital. Everything we have done to date has been with private capital. We weren't in existence when the ARP-20, the $5 billion that the federal government put out under the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program in 2020, Natura didn't exist at that time. And so we have done everything through private funding. I think we will continue to, state of Texas may step in, we'll see what happens. And at some point we'll look at accessing the loans program. We just finished our current private round, and we are in serious conversations about who is our long-term financial partner going to be now that we have a permit in hand, now that we're building a reactor. The other thing that we know is instead of doing top-down estimates on time and cost and construction, we're doing bottom-up, because we've done detailed engineering design, we've done preliminary engineering design, we're doing manufacturing. So the specificity of cost and time, we're really zeroing in on that. And our commercial reactor is 250 times larger in power than our demonstration reactor. So we go from a 1 megawatt thermal to a 250 megawatt thermal, which is 100 megawatt electric. Because of physics, though, that reactor core, I think, is 4 feet wider and 10 feet taller. It's basically the same reactor. And so now we were in the NRC last week. I'm one of the few that will say, and you'll hear it, is that the NRC did exactly what they said they would do in licensing and approving our reactor, and they did it in less time than they said it would take it. They are the world's gold standard in safety. That is something to be leaned into. That is something, if you can't meet their standard, maybe you shouldn't be deploying a reactor. That's kind of the way we look at it. We were in Rockville last week meeting with the NRC, 4 of the 5 commissioners, and they are leaning into, and I think adapting to, small modular reactors, and particularly Generation 4, with this passive safety features that comes from that technology. So I think we're going to see a new licensing era with new technology. That's what we experienced in the Permian Basin 20 years ago. And so I've kind of done this before when we did the fracking. I know that's not a popular word in a lot of places, but 20 years ago we revolutionized the oil and gas industry. I think the same thing is happening today in the advanced nuclear.
So just to sort of round out the conversation on the NRC a little bit, typically the way the NRC, well, let me back up a little bit. The Atomic Energy Act was passed in 1954. So as you can imagine, the derivative regulations largely focused on large light water reactors. Those were the reactors at the time, and that's what was anticipated to be regulated by originally Atomic Energy Commission, and then it derivatively to the NRC. The approach to licensing is twofold. There is one approach where you get a construction license a construction permit first, and then you get an operating license. There is a newer version of the regulations that allows you to get what's called a combined operating license, and that allows you, before you ever put a shovel in the ground, you are able to get your full license. And the reason that that's important is history. So some of you may remember in Seabrook, it was built during the Carter years, and it was fully built, and carrying costs were roughly 21% for that project, and effectively created the bankruptcy of PS&H, so Public Service of New Hampshire. And so the idea was Congress stepped in and said, okay, we need a different licensing regime. What we're seeing now, and that's a long way to get around to my comment, is that, look, this is new technology. It's different kinds of technology. It's not light water technology. Effectively, the outcome is the same with respect to electricity, but the agency has to adapt its approach to licensing. There are exemptions being given, but perhaps the most important thing is what Doug talked about, which is time and cost. And the amount of time that it took for Vogtle to get licensed was excessive, to put it mildly. And most of the utilities are concerned about the time, because time and cost go together, and they don't have the balance sheets to carry this off. And so the NRC is responding in two ways. One is recognizing that the country is looking for more power, and secondly, recognizing that the cost cannot be as excessive as it previously has been. And so you are seeing, as Doug described, you are seeing movement at the NRC. Now my question is, Jim, is the movement fast enough for Wall Street to respond in a way that's going to help accelerate new plant development?
I think it's a bit TBD, but what we've been hearing is something like a 22-month window now to get approvals through the NRC. And if that's the case, that's certainly better than the 10-year process that it took NuScale to get their license. There's just no way to go, through something like that and expect that technology is going to move forward. So, something on the order of 18 to 24 months probably makes sense. And I think that, I think Wall Street would get on board with that.
There is a movement to push the NRC to try and license microreactors in 6 months. I don't know what the outcome of that will be, but you can see that the industry is being extremely aggressive in pushing the agency to try and get these things to market more quickly.
If you don't mind just saying one thing, just to take a step back about the second generation fleet that exists on the planet today. So there's about 440 working reactors on the planet. Roughly 75% of those reactors are American designed and built. Most of them were built in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. One thing about the waste side of this scene, Doug's reactor doesn't produce waste, and there's other designs like that, and that's important to note about the new technologies. But just to stick with the old and some of the new, you can take all of the waste from the US commercial fleet for the last 60 years and store it right on this city block right here, 1 story tall, right? All of it. All of the fuel rods for the last 60 years, and remember, 20% of our electric generation comes from nuclear, second-gen nuclear today. There's, 95 operating reactors? 94. So when we think about what is the challenge, in historically with this scene, it's been the fact that people are really worried about these designs. And yes, you should worry about Russian reactor designs, but not so much about our second-gen fleet, and that's true for most other countries. The other thing I'll say is that, remember, the safety aspects to Doug's design and other designs like Natura's, that's that they're walk-away safe, they don't produce waste, many of the designs. You don't have to have these enormous safety zones. You don't have to be concerned about weapons proliferation or leaks, for that matter, because the mediums that are being used in the fuel, such as the molten salt medium, means that you cannot take the radionuclides and use them or misuse them. So that's really, really important for folks to understand. And I just would also add that when you think about the efficiency of these designs, if you take 2 of those silver water jugs on these tables here in front of you all, you take them and you fill them with uranium, 2 of those jugs produce more electrons in 6 months than the entire state of California renewables portfolio, solar and wind combined. So when we're talking about efficiency, and I think efficiency is really important in our lives these days, and clean is important, and safety is really important, types of electrons, baseload is really important. This is an amazing technology. It really is the salvation for our planet. And when I said earlier, my little editorial about Wall Street and not taking long-term views, it's easy for me to flip those words, but what I'm saying is everybody needs to come together. The federal government, the state governments, they need to work on licensing, local permitting. We can't wait 5 years for XYZ town in northern New York to decide whether or not it wants a reactor, because in the meantime, the jobs associated with that are going to head to Texas or other states, right? I mean, what we have here is an immediate need to change the way we do things, and an immediate opportunity to create a ton of jobs around the tech space. We don't want those jobs going overseas. The tech companies need to wake up to their words and put money behind the reactors. The utilities need to change the way they do business. They need to become aggressive in making decisions and not hang back and wait for states to say, hey, maybe we'll do this. So everybody kind of needs to lean in on this scene, and right away. We have a chance as a nation, seriously, to create a sector that's a lot like the aerospace industry is today. And yeah, it's a little challenge. Boeing has its issues. Yeah, we have a hard time with manufacturing jobs, but you know what? We don't have much of a choice. If all roads in the end lead to safe, secure, reliable, and eventually low cost, backing Doug's company and companies like it are everything.
So you put a lot of weight on the shoulders of the hyperscalers and the companies that are building large data centers. But we've seen those companies, I mean, you're sort of saying that they haven't done much, but we've seen those companies jump right in. You've got Google offering 500 or seeking 500 megawatts from Kairos. You've got Standard Power and NewScale. Amazon bought the data center from Talon. So we are seeing those kinds of activities. What's it going to take to get from an investment of $500 million into X Energy to building at Energy Northwest? What's it going to take to put us over the edge with respect to building? Go ahead, John. You look like you were going to jump in.
Well, so I would actually maybe want to like move that in a tiny little bit of a direction, right? Because I think if everything is going to focus on what's it going to take for this one project to get to this one outcome, I think that's going to create the problem of the time cost issue that you mentioned before, Ellen. I think the thing that we need to do is make sure that we have concerted efforts. I'm going to pick up on what Jim said about you need federal, state governments getting on board and working together to make sure that we appreciate the time cost issues associated with forward movement. And that is one thing that we in New York are putting a lot of time and attention to. I think we appreciate the need for two things. One is what is kind of the order book that actually can be built to get away from the one-off type of investment decision making. And then how do you figure out what are the appropriate kind of, I'm just going to use a bad word, de-risking steps along each part of the process to get to realized projects. I'm going to say that plural. Right? And so that's what actually a bunch of states are organizing to try to help with. So we've got, I'm helping to co-chair an initiative. It's 10 different states, and I'm talking like it's Utah, Wyoming, and Kentucky, Tennessee, and Pennsylvania, New York, and a bunch of us others in between. Are all trying to figure out, all right, like what kind of commitments can we make as states to ensure, right, the economic development and the baseload power requirements that we're seeing that we need, we're going to be able to get them in the appropriate time scale. But what are kind of those pre-construction activities that we can buy down some of that cost-time equation, right? Like how do we get to easy permitting? How do we get to easier licensing? How do we actually get to easier procurement, potentially, of types of units so that when we can get into like a construction phase, we don't worry so much about what the cost overrun looks like, and we can actually build supply chains that are building several different facilities at the same time. And then like the operating, right? Like who are the appropriate off-takers? How do we get that energy integrated into our systems, right? Like we all have energy policies in each of the states. We have to make sure that there's an acceptance and that we've integrated that into the process. Again, not only to get to the first 5, 6, right? This is what are we looking to do to get sustainable industry activity happening. And we appreciate, we're in a first mover, fast follower kind of mindset at this point in time, but it's very considered to try to move past that, and how can we actually start doing that as quickly as possible?
So one of the things that, when you talk about de-risking, one of the things that is very popular, actually, is this notion of a pool of setting the risk among many entities, not just a single. The utilities aren't going to take it on just on their own, which is sort of the previous way of financing. So there are PPAs, you could do, I suppose, contracts for differences, QIPs. Is New York considering a construction while in progress kind of approach?
I won't get that specific yet. Like we'll wait and see like what kind of financial models for any particular. And now I'm going to go back to singular projects, but it could very well be that QIP could come back into play and work, right? Like it did for many years in Gen 2, and we'll have to see like is that a tool that we need to dust off out of the toolbox. I do think that. It should be like we should just not say no to different types of outcomes at this point, right? Because we do need to get a good understanding about what are those types of instruments that are actually going to be beneficial to realizing the outcome.
Well, I'll throw this open, moving to also accelerating the advancement of deployment. I'll throw it open to all three of you. Any bets on whether it's easier or better in a regulated versus a deregulated environment? Because you have PUCs, PSCs that are very open to this. You also have states with moratoria. So what are your thoughts on what's the environment best suited to an increase in deployment and accelerated? Go ahead, Jim.
So I think the scene that unfolds in this arena is going to happen in phases. And what we're focused on right now is the first of a kind risk, the costs of getting the industry up and running, getting Doug's pathway going, getting beyond the 3 or 4 or 5 units. So this first phase means that, in my mind, that it'll have to happen in an unregulated environment. In other words, units get built off balance sheet, but then you can have regulated utilities then step in and buy the units once they're up and running at a set price. So then the question is, who takes the equity risk during the early stages of construction? And is the PPA arrangement going to cover the cost of these first-of-a-kind units? But look, at the end of the day, so I'll predict, I think the tech companies do step in with high-price contracts, long-term contracts. I predict that they step up with equity. I predict that some of the OEMs can afford the overrun costs involved with their product development, maybe not all. And then I also think you're going to see certain regulated utilities start to really lean into that scene. In other words, be there with the catcher's mitt once these units are up and running. They're ready to move. It's just that they can't take on these projects, the construction side of it. And the other side of it is ratepayers, can't take on the risks, the operational risks. Are these units, no offense, again, Doug, to you or your team, but people want to see that unit up and running. They want to know it got delivered at that price on this time scale and it's performing like that. And again, the 3rd, 4th, 5th units, we got to get to those before you start to see the big orders. And I hear what you're saying, that yes, there's groups, states are definitely coordinating. It's awesome. There's coordination amongst the utilities, coordination even at the OEM levels. But until we get a couple of the pathways going, it's going to be hard. And it's going to happen off balance sheet is my prediction for the first phase.
Others?
So Jim has been speaking for the industry for years. I would come to this just to hear him talk because he has been spot on for quite a while. And you've talked about sovereigns in the past. It's going to be either sovereigns or tech companies that make these things happen. We've had that already, quite frankly. In 2020, the federal government put $5 billion into just a few projects under the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program. I mean, the name was what it was supposed to do, was to demonstrate reactors. So far, that hasn't happened. It hopefully will happen. We're not recipients of that. We weren't in existence when that happened, when those funds went out the door. So we're privately funded. But you apologize for the word, and I think you did also. De-risking is not a bad word. That's our obligation. That's for Natura, with our own skin in the game. I think skin in the game is important. That's kind of my oil and gas mentality. If you don't stand to lose or if you don't feel pain when you fail, then maybe you're not properly motivated. So our private investment, of which I'm one, we have a fear of failure. We want to succeed, but it's our obligation to de-risk so that we can get to the point that the market, whatever the market is either through fear of missing out or through demand. And what happens if we don't do it, like we're looking at in Texas, if we don't deploy. We went down that pathway in 2021 with Storm Uri for 4 days when the grid was not performing, and we had hundreds of Texans die as a result of that. Let's don't go there. So, but it's our obligation to de-risk. And so what Natura has done is with our capital, we got the permit. We did all the engineering. We should be able to deploy our first reactor with private funding. If the state of Texas or some other entity steps in and makes that easier and faster, wonderful. We'll take non-dilutive funding if we can find it. At some point, those are going to cross. The risk is going to get low enough because of the work we've done to where the financial market, whatever that may look like, whether it's a sovereign, whether it's a tech company, whether it's a utility or a state, whatever the case may be, to then make those first 4 or 5 happen. And the more we lower the risk, the easier that becomes. I think we're there. I think we're getting there. Actually, I can't predict when. Jim might be able to do that. I can't predict when, but the conversations we're having since we got that permit, the engagement with institutional capital, a new level of investment inquiry that's coming in, even foreign, which may present some difficulties given the technologies that we're talking about, tells me that, okay, there has been a shift in thinking. And one of the most significant transactions that's happened, and it maybe doesn't look like a transaction, is between Microsoft and Constellation. Microsoft issued a PPA. We don't know the terms of that. I think we kind of generally know what it looks like. To Constellation for data centers. In return, Constellation is going to reactivate, bring back online 3 Mile Island. That's about a $3 billion investment to do that. That's a real commercial transaction. And so not many dormant reactors sitting around. In fact, I think that might have been it, maybe one more. And then we're going to have to start deploying new reactors. Again, which ones can go through the licensing process with the NRC? You cannot build a reactor in this country without that. Which ones can get through that process and then demonstrate by their de-risking activities that they have some certainty about time, cost, and performance. That's the pathway we're down, and I think we're converging with the financial community as we speak.
Just to add 2 things before John goes, just to round out the conversation about the Advanced Reactor Development Program, X-Energy is one of the recipients and TerraPower is the other. And I would just amend your comment slightly or add to it because TerraPower is in the process of building in Kemmerer, Wyoming. And the one thing that's interesting—
Not a reactor, though.
Pardon me?
They're not building a reactor.
Well, that's fair.
I'm
fair.
trying to be very specific. TerraPower has filed a construction permit.
Right.
That's been docketed, has not yet been approved, and X-Energy filed one on March 31st that has not yet been docketed.
That's correct. That's correct. But, and I should have been much more precise in my comments, they are moving forward to demonstrate. So the federal government's work is, and money is being put to use there. And the amendment is actually very, very correct. So thank you. The other thing I would mention is that it's not just the Crane Energy Center, which was previously TMI, but it's also the Palisades plant is being repowered in Michigan. And also, we have the potential for NextEra, and they've announced it, so they haven't started, but they've announced the interest in Duane Arnold in Iowa, maybe repowering. So again, you're getting a lot more of not just the interest, but using the current plants to increase their power via either repowering a plant that was previously closed or uprates, which just increases the output of the unit. So John, go ahead.
I was actually just going to, make a comment on Jim's statement and getting back to the original question, Ellen, on, is it a deregulated market? Is it a regulated market? Like, where do we think? And I got to say, as in national conversations, I have always felt back on my heels as a representative of a deregulated market. So thank you for actually putting us on a different side of that equation, Jim. The one thing that I guess the way that I've always seen it is that Again, particularly at the stages of development we're in right now. I mean, I think it's just a level of commitment from all participants in the process to actually make sure we get there. And from the OEM to partnering with the developer to getting to the owner-operator, and then ensuring that the federal state supports are going to be in place. I think it is always going to be the combination of that equation. And if you can get participants in the project who might not necessarily be traditional participants in that project, that's going to change the nature of the equation and who's bearing different risks, right? If a developer is looking at a long-term business model of building multiple units, they may want to take some degrees of risk in a first, second, third project to make sure that they're building their own business model out. So I do think that it depends on making sure that whatever that kind of structure is, that it looks workable and you've got like the appropriate levels of commitment coming in. The thing I'm going to throw in there that's the tough one that we chatted about before is getting the commitment that there's actually going to be people that are going to be actually running these plants over the long term. And if there is a space where I think we're a little back on our heels nationally, is that we have not facilitated and fostered the workforce to actually be in the space that they can actually pick up, finding the careers that they would otherwise work at these particular types of facilities. In New York, we're looking to try to get that kick-started. There's Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute has applied for a workforce grant. NYSERDA is very much supporting that, and we would love to see that come through. I think we're going to need to see a number of different, very highly focused workforce development activities in order to make sure that as we're thinking of financial structures, as we're thinking about reducing risk profiles at all stages of a project, there's got to be somebody at the end that is ready, willing, and able to step in and get things moving. And so that, I think, again, is a space that the federal, the state governments need to make sure that we're committing to helping make sure that that workforce is available.
Am I getting the high sign here on time? We have a few more minutes? Okay. So I'm cognizant, because in the courts you have a red and a green light, and I was getting the red light back there. So I guess workforce is a good way to end this. It seems to me that workforce is both maybe the fundamental issue among many, as well as maybe an easier one to solve. Because if you build it, typically they will come. And I suppose that's a glass half full kind of comment. But the federal government is very interested in putting together funds for more nuclear engineering programs. And also for, we tend at NEI work with the unions to try and ensure that the craft that's necessary. Doug, what's your experience with bringing in people? You have an ongoing enterprise there. What's your experience with bringing in workers?
Well, we've had a unique pathway in that when we launched the project in 2020, we used universities. So initially, Texas A&M University, University of Texas at Austin, Georgia Institute of Technology and ACU, Abilene Christian University, now Texas Tech University has joined that, and I think we have Idaho University also doing some work there. As a result of that, the research dollars that have been deployed by Natura into those universities, we have had hundreds of students through those universities go through the program. We've just hired yesterday, I guess a kind of anecdotal example of a young man who started as a high school student, went through, finishing up his degree. We just hired him at Natura. And so that's a small example of workforce development. The Governor Abbott's Advanced Nuclear Working Group, one of the things that Texas is looking at is workforce development. That's probably greatest illustrated by the Greater Houston Partnership. So the Greater Houston Partnership is you take the business industry and the Chamber of Commerce in Houston, Texas, and kind of roll it all into one entity. That's GHP. Houston is the energy capital of the world. You'll see that if you go into Houston. The question, the Greater Houston Partnership, is how do they remain the energy capital of the world? And one of the things they have decided is we have to lean into advanced nuclear, and molten salt reactors are at the forefront of that. And then we've been working with the Greater Houston Partnership for about 3 years now on their initiatives for workforce development. So we're seeing that happen at the national level. Texas A&M University announced a $200 million project on their Rellis campus, which we're looking at deploying a reactor there. That's workforce development. So you're happening at universities are doing it. You're seeing it happen at state level, like under Governor Abbott's Advanced Nuclear Working Group. And you're seeing private entities like the Greater Houston Partnership. They're saying we're going to see to workforce development. So it's
We're seeing a lot of those kinds of enterprises jumping up because look, nuclear creates good jobs, and nuclear is durable in the sense that it's a very stable asset for the community. It's licensed first for 40 years. It goes to 60 years if you get a license renewed, and then it could go to 80 years if you get a subsequent license renewal. So the idea that the communities are now thinking about the durability of nuclear as opposed to some of the coal plants being closed and maybe being replaced with nuclear, that all is attractive. At least we're positing that that's a very attractive feature for workers in the nuclear sector. So I must say, we're hopeful that when we build, they will come.
Thank you.
And so with that, let me open it up. We didn't get to supply chain. We didn't get to talk about tax benefits or credits. We didn't get to talk about a whole host of issues. So I'm hopeful that we will get questions and then be able to touch on all those issues. Yes, hi.
Great conversation, learning a lot. I think a lot of people in this room are, so appreciate that. Earlier this week, you probably all saw that China announced that it's going to build 10 nuclear reactors, as they do, much faster than we do things here. No idea what that means, but I bet you do, so I'd love to hear.
They're already building 24. It's many more than that.
Yes.
Yeah, they're way into it. And the Russians and Chinese are not just building on their soil, they're using the technology to develop relationships with other countries. And so the Chinese in particular are supplying the equity, the technology, the workforce, the fuel management, the waste management, job training, weapon systems, you name it. It's a real thing. And so we've forgotten as a nation maybe a little bit about our foreign policy history, especially lately, but look, we have a lot of good relationships still with a lot of countries, and foundationally, a lot of those relationships emanated around our commercial nuclear fleet development over the years. And so again, there's a lot of countries looking to our nation to pull forward our technology suite because we have it, we're it. And the NRC is the gold standard. If we can get the licenses in place, then there's customer orders waiting from other countries. Folks are waiting for us. They want it now, right now.
Our project, I'm a 40-year oil and gas guy. I was retiring. I really wanted to retire and funded a project at ACU just because I thought it would make the world a better place. And the Department of Energy showed up in 2018, flew us up into DC in 2019 and said, you have no idea how important this is. You have to build this reactor. We have to beat China. We have to beat Russia. And the U.S. needs to capture this technology. So when we held our hands up in that meeting and said, okay, I guess I'm coming out of retirement, it was for a national security. It was the DOE said, we need you to do this. And so that was at the forefront of the thinking then. China had a big announcement last week about a molten salt reactor, thorium reactor refueling online, which they can do. But they said, we have taken all the U.S. technology, they sat on it, we're moving it forward. And we recognized that 5 years ago, 6 years ago, when the DOE said we need you to start this project, but we're not catching up, we're falling behind.
Yeah, to put a fine point on it, it's a 100-year relationship that China and Russia are building with these other countries because of the dependence on this source of generation. So just if you think of it in those terms, it's a big deal.
So the Poles, the Bulgarians, the Romanians, all the nations sitting right on the front lines of the Russian border want this technology now, right now, and they are ready to move. There's established relationships with GE and Synthos Green Energy in Poland. Synthos has a right to deploy the technology, 26 units, GE BWRX 300 units. There was an announcement about the AP1000, Westinghouse is going to be building in Poland. There's a host of nations, the Koreans, the Japanese, are working hard to help our country and help companies like Doug's. They're investing in them directly to move things along because they need the technology.
Back there?
Yes. First of all, thank you. This has been very interesting. You all spoke, Jim, you talked about the need for long-term commitments, and Doug, you talked about speeding up the licensing process, and John, you talked about ensuring federal support. But what we've seen in the last couple of years is a pendulum shift. So there was a large push toward renewables and all these federal programs funding it with equity tied to it. And now, not only have you seen it kind of stall, but you've seen actual projects that have had licenses where the licenses have been put on hold. So for instance, Equinor with their wind project out on Long Island. So I'm curious from an investment standpoint, because obviously investors want certainty, whether it's a state, whether it's a utility, or whether it's private equity firms, how is this impacting the market, or how do you think it will impact the market, so much uncertainty? And that the next administration could just turn around and shift the policy yet again.
Look, I don't want to wade too far into politics, but investors hate uncertainty, right? They hate long-term uncertainty. They hate long-term equity risk, and especially where you could build a $5 billion reactor and then have it not work. Who does that? Maybe the government, maybe a government like our government does that. And that would argue, by the way, I mean, look, that would argue for a lot of government support. So let me say this. Aerospace. I mean, where did jet engine technology come from? Who developed it? When? Why did we do that? Probably because the Germans and we all were fighting a war and we wanted faster and better planes. So did they. So here we are today and we fly in aircraft, but a lot of that supply chain and those companies to this day benefit from enormous federal spending on fighter planes and missiles and space technology. We should be really focused on this, right? We all care about our kids' future and this planet. And that's why I do this. I'm not in it. Yeah, I have a job and I love my clients and love what I do, but at the heart of this is getting this right. And I don't know most of you in this room, but you all seem like good folks. Let's all work differently and better to get it right. And let's not just say, oh, well, the government changed policy. Well, then go change it, and vote for people that are actually going to get the job done. We just need, it sucks. It's a mess. That's my honest answer.
Best quote of the day.
Sir?
You've spoken about technology, you've spoken about regulation. By the way, my name is Michael Lubell, and reflecting back, it's almost, 46 years that TMI occurred. I was teaching a course in energy and public policy at the time. The mood shifted so strongly from that one event, and I still remember this, with newspapers coming to me and saying, what's your reaction to this? What I'm concerned about now is you've spoken about all the technical details, the regulatory and so on and so forth. The one thing that no one has addressed is how the public is reacting to this. And I think that if we don't plan for at least some kind of initiative to make people aware of the dramatic improvements in the technology, this could fall flat. One mistake, and in this country, and it goes down the drain. I think we have to look toward the future of the public and how they're going to react to things. And I haven't heard you speak about that, if you can address it.
Yeah, it's a great question. Look, I think the sentiment's changed dramatically on this topic. So I was trying indirectly, it's Michael, right, to indirectly make some points. I made the point about the waste from the existing second-gen fleet. I mean, we're all breathing coal dust right now. If we announced every day that another 15,000 people globally died from coal dust, and that's actually kind of the number, maybe a lot more than that, we all know coal's bad, right? We're all trying to take coal offline. But you know what? I hate to be flip about it, but I'll be an ass now. I mean, not a lot of people died from TMI. Now, you could say, well, gee, Jim, they were 15 minutes from wiping out half of Pennsylvania, but that's just not the case. And, you know, you want to really get into a long conversation. There's a lot of things that we do that are really wrecking our planet that we kind of know about but don't talk about. It ain't coming from the nuclear fleet. Yeah. And I grew up right next to the first reactor built on this planet in this country, okay? Row Yankee. I used to fish in the pond outside Row Yankee. And I knew all the workers that were there. This is in Western Mass. I still fish there. It's no longer there. The plant isn't there. It was a great plant. Should have never been removed in 1990, along with a lot of others. I watched the protesters ride bikes to Row Yankee and stand outside the plant. I watched the success in that state and other states, you know, in Vermont, taking out Vermont Yankee. There's other problems we have. It ain't this one. And this topic is a public opinion. I talk all the time about this. People need to wake up now, and our newspaper reporters need to write the truth. Doug's technology is safe. Explain why it's safe. Doug shouldn't just have to go around and do it. There should be a lot of reports on this.
Yeah, and like, look, there is a very big focused effort in New York State to do the appropriate education, do the outreach, make sure that there's an understanding of what we're looking at here in New York. You know, we've launched what we call our master plan process, and a lot of this is, you know, it's going to be doing different assessments, analyses, looking at the different application spaces, taking on, you know, waste, proliferation type issues. And it's not necessarily like we in New York, through our master planning process, are going to be, you know, learning anything, you know, highly unique to a New York situation. But the purpose of it is to make sure that there is a focused New York education effort that's underway, so that we can leverage that when we are around the state, trying to make sure people do have an appreciation for what the economy is doing, why this technology suite is coming to the fore, and why we're making the decisions to move forward with that. So it is actually quite integral to the way we're at least approaching this, and we do appreciate the need for education. It's maybe going back to Ellen's opening remark, like, people do have to appreciate this is not like our father's nuclear facilities anymore. It's a very different technology type, technology suite, and it's going to have very different uses. And we just have to make sure we're educating.
I would just add, Gallup just did a poll recently, and I was happy to see that it was Gallup and not an industry group, because everybody trusts, you know, the independent pollsters more than an industry group. And they came up with more than 60% of the public support nuclear. So that is an enormous change from where we were. Now, if you look at Republicans versus Democrats, there's still that distinction, 70% of 70+% of Republicans and just about 50, a little under 50% of Democrats. But the key is independents. 61% of independents support nuclear. That was startling to me, because that's the swing vote. Those are the individuals that are, in my view, and according to the poll, gettable. That's really important. So I think the concern is that everybody thinks their neighbor doesn't support nuclear, and what it turns out is that that's not accurate. And the other thing to note is, around the operating plants, we get enormously high positive results from public polling around the plants themselves, because the plants are good citizens by and large. So just to sort of answer your question about the public, I think we need to sort of look at the polling more carefully. The other thing is that boomers, my generation, we are the worst at support for nuclear. That the youngsters, anybody under 40 is now a youngster, basically. But that the youngsters all are comfortable with technology. And they view nuclear as just another form of technology. And it's a good form because typically that sector, that demographic, is very interested in clean energy, in non-emitting, non-carbon emitting sources. So just a little bit of additional information to respond.
I think we have to pay attention to the math. When 3 Mile Island happened, nuclear was optional because we had all the coal, all the natural gas, all the oil we wanted. We didn't have a climate agenda. So we could take it or leave it. And they've said that fracking in Fukushima killed the first Renaissance, which was partly true, but it's also the reason we're 15 years behind the curve. When we hit peak coal production, which was the workhorse of the grid, and I'm not disagreeing with what Jim is saying about the adverse effects of coal, but when coal began to come offline, really in 2008, 2010, nuclear became inevitable at that point. Because you got to replace that dispatchable power, which means 24/7, 365. Wind and solar can't do that. That's when nuclear became inevitable. And I was doing fracking at the time. We were developing.
That's coming from a gas guy.
Well, oil guy, different thing. Permian's oil, Barnett Shale's natural gas. But you got to pay attention to the math. And so that's when we said in 2004, if you were to take hydrocarbons off the grid, primarily coal, nuclear becomes inevitable. You have to have it. So we're 15 years behind the curve. Today, I've had a rig blow up in the Delaware Basin, and after you ask the question, did anybody get killed? Nope, everybody got off the rig. You pull that rig off location, put another rig on it, and get back to drilling because you have to. You can't not have energy. We tried that in 2021. We don't want to go there. Two things. One is that's why the NRC, being the world's gold standard in how hard it is to get through that process, the safety diligence, we can't compromise on safety. We don't want to deploy unsafe reactors because then something could happen. And if something does happen, which it probably will at some level or another, we might have to buck up, push through the problem, solve it, and keep producing because we're out of options as far as power. And we don't want to go into no power. That's worse.
So I'm told one last question.
This has been really helpful. I'm curious to hear your perspective since you mentioned China is exporting their reactors and using it to build long-term relationships. And since data center demand, it's surging in the United States, but there's also interest in building data centers around the world. I'm curious if with these new, safer nuclear technologies under development, if there's more interest in also trying to export our technology to different countries, and if so, what does that look like? I'm wondering particularly if we think that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has the best safety certification process, if that would make it theoretically easier to then deploy a reactor in another country.
So the
that's
answer is
Ellen.
yes to all of your questions.
Yeah.
So what we're seeing is many more Department of Commerce supported Department of State delegations going with the industry to these various countries. My CEO just went to Poland. We know NuScale's in Bulgaria. We know Westinghouse is in multiple places. We know Ghana's looking at reactors. I mean, Singapore, the Philippines. I could go through, chapter and verse. But the answer is you need government help here to be able to open some of the international opportunities. So that's one thing. The other thing is getting an NRC license, and Doug talked about this before. Getting an NRC license will be the ticket, basically, for nuclear technology to be exported throughout the world, for U.S. nuclear technology to be exported throughout the world. And so we are moving that the industry is moving that as quickly as possible, because when you export to some other country, you're also going to get more interest here because the building will go there, you'll get efficiencies, and then it'll be much more likely that you will be able to locate something here more quickly, more efficiently, more cost effectively. Anything to add?
Agreed.
Totally agree. Yeah.
Okay. Well, and on that note,
Can we have a hand for our panel, please? Thanks so much. I think we can all agree that was incredibly educational and fascinating discussion. And I would just say to Jim that if being an ass means having the kind of knowledgeable and frank conversation, we need more asses around, because I think that was great. I did want to acknowledge a number of our OEP board members here. Jay Warrenklein is here, Kate Fruscher is here, and we're very fortunate to have our founder and chairman here, Yossi Hollander, who was the original visionary behind creating an organization that could bring people together for these kinds of dialogues. So if we could just have a hand for Yossi as well. Thanks very much.